Hola, clase. This is a quick introduction to the comparisons of inequality, comparisons of equality, and superlative structures, which are on exam 3. These were covered in your My Spanish Lab lessons, but were not something that was built in for during class time practice this semester. So this is a bit of just a down and dirty introduction to how they work. I highly recommend the practice resources on this concept at the BK Nelson Spanish Language and Culture website. If you Google Colby Spanish, Colby like the cheese, the website will come up. There's practice on that website for preterite and imperfect. There's practice on that website for the direct and indirect object pronouns. That's under the pronouns do and pronouns io links. And then there's also practice on the comparisons. They don't have practice on the superlative, which is the third concept we'll see in this presentation, but there is practice on the comparisons, and I recommend it. First, we're going to start talking about comparisons of inequality. Las comparaciones de desigualdad. This information is on pages 131 and 132 in your textbook. Preparando las vacaciones de primavera. Mis amigos y yo siempre vamos a México para las vacaciones de primavera. Este año queremos estar en México más de 5 días. Este año vamos menos hombres que mujeres. El año pasado, mi amigo Miguel durmió más de 10 horas todos los días. Miguel dice, no quiero dormir menos de 10 horas. Mi amiga Alicia fue más activa que Miguel. The comparisons of inequality allow us to talk about having more or less than of a certain thing, a sustantivo, to talk about someone being more or less than a certain way, an adjective, or to compare that somebody does an action more or less a certain way. So we use this structure to compare nouns, sustantivos, adjectives, adjectivos, and adverbs, adverbios. It works very similarly to the way that more than and less than work in English. The main exception to these formulas is that so más whatever que and menos whatever que mean more whatever than and less whatever than. We use más or menos followed by de when the comparison involves a specific number, such as on the previous slide here where Miguel says, I don't want to sleep fewer than 10 hours. 10 horas is a specific number, so it's menos de instead of que there, since it's followed by a specific number. There are some comparative adjectives that are irregular. You should look at the information on page 132 because it explains it in a little bit greater detail. Just like in English, something isn't more good or more bad, like we say better or worse. There are irregular ones like that in Spanish. Instead of más bueno, we say mejor. Instead of más malo, we say peor. The exception to that would be if you want to talk about somebody's moral character, you could say that they are más bueno or más malo than somebody else. And that is explained in greater detail on page 132. But for all other uses of better or worse, you should use the irregular form mejor and peor. Smaller can either be más pequeño or menor. Bigger can be más grande or mayor. Younger can be más joven or menor. And older can oftentimes be más viejo or mayor when we're talking about a thing. However, when you're talking about a person being older or less old than someone else, it's more polite to use mayor instead of más viejo or menos viejo. Estas vacaciones quiero practicar más español que el año pasado. Miguel dice, quiero ser mejor en español que mis compañeros. Vamos a practicar. Miguel está practicando español con la señora. Ella es blank que él, menor, grande, joven, or mayor. Pause the video for a second so that you can think about your answer. La señora is obviously an older woman, so ella es mayor que él. Miguel dice, hola, ¿puedo hablar español con usted? Y ella dice, sí, claro que puedes hablar español. ¿Y tú eres el mayor en tu familia, sí o no? Yo tengo una hermana menor, entonces yo soy la mayor en mi familia. Yo no soy el menor en mi familia. O la menor, yo no soy la menor. Vamos a comparar ahora el mar de Irlanda y el mar de Cancún. Recuerda, Irlanda está en el norte y Cancún está en México en el sur. El mar o el océano de Irlanda está blank, caliente, blank, el mar de Cancún. Menos caliente de, más caliente de, más caliente que, o menos caliente que. Pause the video so that you can think about your answer. If we're comparing the hotness of the water at Ireland and Cancun, Ireland is going to be less hot than Cancun. El mar de Irlanda está menos caliente que el mar de Cancún. Los amigos dicen, el agua está más caliente que mi bañera. ¿Te gusta más el mar que la montaña? ¿Sí o no? A mí me gustan los dos. No me gusta el mar más que la montaña. Now we're going to switch gears and talk about comparisons of equality and the superlative. This is on pages 135, 138, and 139 in your textbook. Comparisons of equality allow us to talk about things that are equal, that I have as much as you, I have as many of something as you do, I am as a certain way as you are, or I do something as a certain way as you do it. Mi amiga Juana es médica y su esposo Luis es profesor de literatura. Juana trabaja tantas horas como Luis. Molly es abogada. Ella gana tanto dinero como el juez. There are three formulas for the comparisons of equality. The first one, tan blank como, or as blank as, allows us to compare adjectives like inteligente and adverbios like rápidamente. Remember that an adjective is a word that describes a person, place, or thing, and an adverb is a word that describes a verb. It adds information about the verb. For example, rápidamente o frecuentemente. We use tanto, tanta, tantos, and tantas blank como to compare nouns or sustantivos. Remember that nouns are people, places, and things. Because nouns in Spanish have inherent gender and number, when we compare them, we need to use a comparative form that allows us to reflect their gender and number. For example, yo tengo tantos perros como tú. Él tiene tantas clases como ella. Miguel tiene tanto dinero como Ángela. Notice that the form of tanto that I use agrees in gender and number with the noun whose quantity I'm comparing. Finally, we use tanto como, as much as, to compare equal frequency of doing an action. I work as much as you. Yo trabajo tanto como tú. Here are a few more examples. Ramón y Orquídea son peluqueros. José atiende a tantos clientes como Orquídea. Estos peluqueros son tan graciosos como los actores de películas cómicas. Durante el fin de semana, los restaurantes trabajan tanto como los hospitales. Entonces, los sábados, los cocineros están tan estresados como los enfermeros. El domingo, todos los trabajadores quieren dormir tanto como un bebé. La bebé dice, esta es la mejor siesta de mi vida. This last sentence here is an example of our next concept, which is called the superlative. The superlative is a set of structures that allows us to talk about the extremes of some description. And there are two structures for it. The first structure allows us to say things like, the interpreters have the most stressful job in the world, where we characterize something as the extreme of whatever quality it is, and then have the option of signaling the group. The next structure, called the isimo ending, allows us to say that something is really, really, really a certain way. They both are categorized as superlative structures in Spanish, but they function differently and can only be used separately. Let's look at the first structure together. If we want to say something like the most stressful job in the world in Spanish, there's a three-part formula that we can use. The first part of the formula is to simply name the thing using the article, like el trabajo. The second part of the formula is to give the comparison using más or menos. So if I'm talking about the most stressful job, I would say más estresante. The third part is optional, and it allows us to signal the group out of which something is an extreme. In English, we would say that it's the most stressful job in the world, but in Spanish, note that we use the preposition de, the most stressful job of the world, literally. So, name the thing including the article, which is the el, la, los, or las, give the comparison using más or menos, and then if you want to say the group out of which it is the most extreme, you introduce that group with de. Los intérpretes tienen el trabajo más estresante del mundo. The next structure, the isimo ending, allows us to say that something is very, very, very a certain way. For example, el viernes por la noche, las amas de casa están cansadísimas. They're not just cansadas, they're muy, muy, muy cansadas. To express that, we can add the isimo ending onto just about any adjective. Since amas de casa is feminine and plural, they would be cansadísimas. When you're expressing an extreme of something, it's either like the most stressful job in the world, or it's really, really, really stressful, estresantísimo. But we can't combine these two structures. There will be a question involving each structure on the exam. Be sure that you read the instructions carefully, and especially on the short answer question, be sure that you use the structure that's indicated in the instructions. Raúl es el obrero más romántico del mundo. Ayer le propuso matrimonio a su novia. Just like with the comparisons of irregularity, there are a couple of irregulars, the comparisons of inequality. There are some irregulars, but they're the same ones that we saw with the comparisons of inequality. So for the best, it would be el mejor. Notice that mejor can change to mejores depending on the number, and the article el, la, los, or las reflects the gender. So we have for the most bueno would be mejor, the most or least malo would be peor, the most pequeño would be menor, the most grande would be mayor, the most joven would be menor, and the most viejo would be mayor. Los actores, por ejemplo, tienen el mejor sueldo. A veces los periodistas tienen días difíciles. El año pasado, Sergio fue a Guatemala para tomar fotos de la erupción del volcán. Fue el día más peligroso de su profesión. We could also say, using the isimo ending, that fue un día peligrosísimo. Fue un día peligrosísimo. Los contadores tienen días malos también. En Estados Unidos, abril es el peor mes del año para ellos. Él dice, estoy ocupadísimo hasta el 15 de abril. Practiquemos. En el año 2001, Halle Berry ganó un Oscar por su actuación en la película Monsters Ball. Ella fue blank actriz del año 2001. La menor, la peor, la mejor o el mejor. Pause the video now to choose your answer.